The second most commonly described ET race is the Nordic one, called that because they usually are blonde-haired and blue-eyed. They have been described the same way in remote parts of the world by contactees who were so isolated that they had never read any UFO books or previously seen any Nordic photos or descriptions. Contactees almost universally describe the Nordics as being in their late 20s, and unlike the more cerebral Greys, they are generally friendlier towards contactees. Of the ET races, the Nordics are the ones most commonly described as looking like us, and most often, they are the ones that work on Earth, posing as humans. In the 1950s, George Adamski and Howard Menger wrote that the Nordics come back and forth to Earth from hidden bases on Venus. Another report says that the Nordics traveled to Edwards Air Force Base in the 1950s to meet with Eisenhower and other U.S. government officials. Other ETs approached Churchill, Stalin, and other world leaders. It seems that the Nordics offered ET technology to the major world governments if they would dismantle all nuclear weapons. Reportedly, Eisenhower refused, but still wanted alien technology. The ETs declined, fearing that the US would use it to develop even more destructive weapons. Kevin, a contactee, says one ET told him that at least 4 different ET races work closely with all major governments on the planet. They have been doing so for many years, and will only give us their technology a little bit at a time. They don't want us to use it to destroy each other. Contactees report Nordic men to be of similar heights as humans, ranging from about 5.5 feet to over 6 feet tall, and the women are about 5.5 feet to just under 6 feet tall. They typically have Caucasian-like skin colors, with one Nordic described as having a medium-colored suntan. Both sexes often have long blonde hair, but it can run the full range of colors from blonde to black and be short or long. The Nordics, like the Greys, are typically described as wearing one-piece jumpsuits that can be either form-fitting or somewhat loose, covering them from neck to toe. Their suits usually are seamless with no buttons, pockets, zippers, or other openings. Often, when the Nordics put small objects into their jumpsuits, a formerly invisible pocket-like opening appears and then closes seamlessly after the object is inserted. The ETs say they can take apart the atoms of their clothing and reassemble them. Unlike the typically asexual Greys, the Nordics commonly appear as movie star-like handsome men and beautiful women. Many contactees report that the Nordic women have shapely forms with rounded hips and breasts. However, although they appear as different genders, it is unclear whether they have sex organs since no contactee has reported seeing any Nordics nude. Frank thought the Nordics did not have functioning sex organs but simply had a preference for bodies with either a masculine or feminine appearance. A few abductees report having been sexually seduced aboard ET ships by human-looking aliens, but none describe them as being Nordics or Greys. Frank never saw any Nordic or Grey children. When he asked them about reproduction, the Nordics told him that almost no advanced space-traveling ET civilizations have sexual intercourse and give birth the way the animals do on Earth. The ETs explained that birth to them is more like teleportation. Nordic men and women may choose to live as couples for their spiritual growth, and they can be together for many hundreds of years. When a couple decides to have a child, they materialize a young teenage-looking body the way they materialize their ships. He explained that at the moment of birth for humans, the spirit enters and takes control of the human body when the baby draws its first breath. It's similar for the ETs, he said, except that they materialize a nearly full-grown body and invite the spirit into the body to take its first breath. To Frank, that seemed like a better way. No painful childbirth, no dirty diapers. Like the Greys, the Nordics reportedly have a trickster mentality and enjoy playing what some humans call practical jokes. Other writers have mentioned their deadpan humor. Frank experienced this one time while driving his car to a UFO meeting in a nearby town. As Frank drove along in the early evening with the radio on, he was thinking about what he would talk about when the headlights began alternately flashing, left, right, continuously. He reached down to the dash and turned off the lights, but they continued flashing. Deciding that the car had an electrical problem, Frank wondered how safe it was to drive at night. Oh well, he thought. I'll have to go to the mechanic tomorrow. Then, suddenly he heard on the radio, news flash. We interrupt this program, but then, the radio went dead. Oh, great. Frank thought, now the radio too. But then the radio voice continued, hello, Frank. He was thoroughly surprised that his radio was talking to him, but then, he recognized the familiar voice of one of the Nordics. He said, so, you're the one fooling around with my headlights. The Nordic laughed, don't worry, they're working fine now. We have news for you. And then, he gave Frank new information for the people in Frank's talk that night. Frank had long been aware of the Nordics' trickster nature, so he was not particularly surprised about the headlights and radio. However, this was the first time he realized that their technology was so advanced that they could take control of his car radio and talk to him. It was even more surprising that they could hear him reply through a radio that didn't have a microphone. In another example of Nordic trickery, Frank had been traveling, and after a long day on the road, he finally crawled into the motel bed after midnight. He had just started to drift off when the TV set suddenly turned on. Some TV sitcom was playing, and the volume was deafening. Afraid that he would wake up the guests in the rooms next door, Frank fumbled in the dark for the remote, clicked the TV set off, and pulled the covers up again. As he began to relax, the TV turned back on, but there was a different program on, some sports show. As before, the volume was loud. Annoyed with the faulty TV, Frank sat up, clicked the TV off again with the remote. Then, he got up, walked over, and yanked the TV electrical plug from the wall socket. That should take care of it, he thought, as he made a mental note to complain to the manager in the morning. Before he could get back into bed, the unplugged TV set flickered back on, and a voice said, hello, Frank. Having TV troubles? Startled, Frank jerked his head around toward the TV set to see the familiar face of one of his Nordic contacts. The Nordic had a faint smile and seemed to be thoroughly enjoying his trick. Irritated, Frank said, how about letting a guy get some sleep? The visitor said, in a minute. You will want to hear this. And then, the Nordic gave Frank directions to meet with them in the woods the next day for a trip on one of their ships. Once again, the Nordics had demonstrated their superior technology. They could talk to him through an unplugged TV set, and they could also hear him through an unplugged set with no microphone. Something similar was described by Howard Menger, who wrote that one of the ETs also spoke to him through his car radio. And Preston Dennett describes one contactee, who reported that his TV sets started turning on and off by themselves. Sometimes, when he passed a TV, his sound would go up high, or when he passed a radio, the volume would go higher by itself. All these are examples of the aliens' childlike way of doing things. They seem to like to surprise us.